although the possibility of pursuing other objectives had been considered. Ceuta ultimately became the first objective of the Portuguese crown. The potential involvement in the conquest of the Islamic Kingdom of Granada was abandoned, as it would have provoked strong opposition from Castile, which viewed that region as the natural direction of its own Reconquista efforts. Even Portuguese support for Castile's military initiatives would have been seen as an unacceptable interference, violating Castilian rights of conquest. On the other hand, Ceuta was a key port city with major commercial importance, controlling the Strait of Gibraltar and the passage between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Ships that launched attacks against Christian vessels and the Algarve coast, engaging in piracy and raids that had not yet ceased, operated in and out of Ceuta. Capturing the city would, therefore, increase the safety of Christian navigation and tighten the pressure on the Kingdom of Granada, which would see its connections with North Africa disrupted. Moreover, the weakening of the Marinid dynasty, which had held power in Morocco since the early 13th century, had long been known. By the early 15th century, the Marinids, or Banu Marin, were facing numerous uprisings and internal strife that had significantly weakened them. Their limited capacity to resist an attack was no secret, and was certainly a significant factor in King JOÁO I's decision. Even if the broader course of Portuguese overseas expansion wasn't fully mapped out from the beginning, the Ceuta plan was far from accidental. It may not have been part of a fully developed long-term strategy, but there is no doubt that the decision to attack Ceuta was deliberate. It is true that if the aim had been to secure grain supplies, scarce in the kingdom at the time, the effort would have been in vain. The main grain-producing areas were further south, along the Atlantic coast. After its conquest in 1415, Ceuta not only failed to supply Portugal with grain, but also required continuous provisioning, often with wheat brought from faraway places. Similarly, the hoped-for access to African gold was not achieved. Since gold was mined in regions farther south in the African continent and traded through Moroccan ports, the Portuguese presence in Ceuta led to the diversion of trade routes, dashing any hopes of capturing the valuable cargo of caravans heading for the coast. In any case, the expedition to Ceuta had been carefully planned, likely starting as early as 1409, although preparations only intensified after peace was made with Castile in 1411. The initiative clearly came from the Crown, the only institution in Portugal at the time capable of envisioning, organizing, and executing an undertaking of such scale. From intelligence gathered by spies about the city to be conquered, to assembling a large fleet estimated at around 200 ships and 20,000 men, and securing the financial means to launch the operation, never before had the Portuguese crown committed itself to such a massive endeavor. What is even more remarkable is that all of this was done while keeping the fleet's true destination a secret, to the extent that almost all participants only learned where they were headed once they had already arrived in the Algarve. Among the crown's motivations for promoting the campaign was the need to provide the nobility with opportunities to increase their wealth through conquest. The royal ability to grant new lands or income had been virtually exhausted, especially with the peace with Castile leaving the nobility militarily idle. An action like the one at Ceuta would mobilize the nobles for war, but would channel their efforts beyond the kingdom's borders and against the enemies of the Christian faith, for those seeking prestige and material rewards through military means. This campaign offered both. The move into North Africa was seen as a natural continuation of the Reconquista. The enemy was the same. The method of warfare and territorial conquest was similar, and even the north to south direction of expansion fit within the centuries-long Christian advance. The intention of fighting Islam in Morocco as an extension of the Portuguese Reconquista had already been expressed by King Afonso IV, although it was never realized. At the time, the crown had even received several crusade bulls from the papacy, which blessed the idea and granted indulgences to those who took part in such a war, making it a postponed plan that would eventually be fulfilled under King JOÁO I. Ceuta therefore appeared as a promising opportunity for immediate gain, but it also likely represented a chance for the king to grant new lands acquired in conquest, along with other rewards, to the nobles who took part in the war. The monarchy and nobility thus found common ground in their shared interest in capturing the city. The fact that the military action was not directed against fellow Christians, but rather against enemies of Christianity, and that the Church endorsed the conquest, served to legitimize it both for those involved and in the eyes of the Christian courts across Europe. The African stronghold offered other attractions as well. The chronicler Gomes Yanes de Zurara, who around 1450 described the conquest of the Moroccan city in his continuation of the Chronicle of King JOÁO I, known as the Chronicle of the Conquest of Ceuta, recorded, for example, the position of João Afonso de Alenquer, the overseer of the royal treasury, Vedor da Fazenda, who supported the capture of the city, suggesting financial motivations behind the project. João Afonso would have been well aware of the crown's dire financial situation, but rather than being a visionary mastermind with grand designs for a long-term expansion plan, or the spokesperson for a solid, structured, and self-aware commercial bourgeoisie, João Afonso was likely a practical man. He probably supported the campaign to Ceuta because, based on the information he had, the city appeared to be both wealthy and easy to conquer. Even if he did not state it in such terms, his position as royal treasurer reflects an outlook geared toward an immediate and highly profitable operation. It's clear that after the conquest, sectors connected to Portuguese trade began developing interests in Ceuta, not in Moroccan trade, which had shifted elsewhere, but in the business of supplying the city itself. Almost everything needed to sustain and provision the stronghold had to be transported by sea from Portugal, thus creating new commercial links. But it must be emphasized once more, both as a project and in its execution, the conquest of Ceuta was a royal initiative planned and carried out by the crown. The royal princes, Infantes Dom Duarte, Dom Pedro, and Dom Henrique, played prominent roles in it. They were among the most enthusiastic advocates of the idea, joined the fleet, and participated personally in the fighting. Through acts of military bravery, they sought to earn their knighthood in line with medieval ideals, rather than through tournaments or mock combat. In fact, after the city had been taken, the king, who was himself present in Ceuta, knighted his sons in the former mosque, which had since been converted and consecrated as a Christian temple. This symbolic act, as well as the participation of the monarch, the royal princes, including the heir to the throne, the old constable Nuno Álvares Pereira, and the highest ranks of Portuguese nobility, clearly demonstrates the importance the crown placed on the capture of Ceuta and its full commitment to the enterprise. The royal family clearly understood what was at stake: the need to secure a path that would ensure the kingdom's viability and the survival of the new dynasty itself. Even if there was no initial imperial plan, or even a clear vision of building an empire, the expedition to Ceuta was not regarded as a mere raid for plunder. Otherwise, the presence of the king and so many high-ranking members of the royal family and court would not have been necessary. Their participation highlights just how central the Ceuta campaign was to the Portuguese crown and the dynasty it represented. The conquest of the city was completed on August 22, 1415, after less than 2 days of siege. However, once the initial objectives had been met, a critical question arose. Should they load up all they could and return to Portugal, abandoning the city? Or, without neglecting the rewards, should they instead remain and leave behind a garrison to defend it against the likely Moorish attacks? It is somewhat surprising that a debate took place within the Royal Council, considering the scale and effort of the operation. The decision was made to retain control of what had been a wealthy and active port, with the intention of continuing expansion into Morocco. King JOÁO III clearly supported this idea, though it proved difficult to find someone willing to remain in such a dangerous and remote location. This difficulty became evident during several attempts to appoint a frontier commander or captain to oversee the city's defense. The first candidate was Nuno Álvares Pereira, the experienced war leader and still constable of the kingdom, but he declined the offer. Two other noblemen who had been present were also approached, but neither accepted the role. Eventually, Dom Pedro de Meneses, standard-bearer alferez to Prince Dom Duarte, stepped forward. He was thus appointed by the king as the first captain of Ceuta, a member of a noble lineage whose destiny would become closely tied to Portugal's presence in North Africa due to their service to the crown. Dom Pedro would later be granted the title of Count of Villarreal in 1424. Around 3,000 soldiers remained with him to defend a city. Ceuta would become a sort of small military enclave in Muslim territory, too far from Portugal to be efficiently supplied or quickly reinforced in case of emergency. The city required defense by both land and sea, and the surrounding territory could not support any stable agriculture due to the constant threat of attack and the destruction of crops by Moorish forces. Ceuta came to exist in a state of near-permanent siege, with the Portuguese confined within the fortifications. The city was never self-sufficient and depended entirely on Portugal for both provisions and manpower. Thus, far from resolving Portugal's problems, the conquest of Ceuta actually exacerbated them. Once the initial euphoria had passed, the city needed to be supplied with goods and soldiers, all gathered, mobilized, and transported from a kingdom already marked by a lack of natural and financial resources, as well as a shortage of people to cultivate its lands. Among the common folk sent to Ceuta, convicts dominated, men sentenced to serve their time there and atone for their sins. Almost all were male. The few women brought to North Africa, according to records, were either prostitutes from Portugal or, later on, women exiled from the kingdom. A few may have accompanied volunteer husbands, but the number of women in the city remained very small throughout the 15th century, and the European population of Ceuta did not grow significantly through natural reproduction. From every angle, Ceuta depended entirely on its continued connection to Portugal for survival. The disappointing outcomes of the 1415 campaign and the high costs of maintaining Ceuta cooled the Portuguese crown's appetite for further conquests. Until the end of King JOÁO I's reign in 1433, there were no additional offensive military initiatives that could compare to the scale of the expedition in which the king and princes had personally taken part. Defending the Moroccan stronghold consumed so many resources and demanded such effort that there was neither the capacity nor enthusiasm to plan a similar action. Portugal had reached a new impasse: either abandon Ceuta or break its isolation. The only way to do the latter was by expanding Portuguese presence in Morocco, and based on past experience, that meant continuing territorial conquests in North Africa. Only after King JOÁO I's death and the accession of King Duarte were new steps taken to resume expansion. The chosen target was the city of Tangier, another well-known maritime port, also strategically located near the Strait of Gibraltar, but this time on the Atlantic coast. Not without sparking intense debate within the kingdom and at court, the Tangier expedition was organized and carried out in 1437, once again under the crown's initiative, and financed through funds approved in the Cortes, held in Evora in April 1436. The princes Dom Henrique and Dom Fernando joined the campaign, the former as the leading advocate of African conquests, and the latter hoping to match the achievements of his elder brothers at Ceuta. With them went many prominent nobles, and around 6,000 men, less than half of the 14,000 originally deemed necessary. It was difficult to rally troops in a kingdom where manpower was scarce, and even those who answered the call had to be transported in ships that were also in short supply. The attack on Tangier took place in September 1437, but it ended in disaster for the Portuguese. Unlike the secretive campaign for Ceuta, this expedition lacked both the element of surprise and the planned number of troops. Facing a numerically superior enemy, the military operation led by Prince Dom Henrique resulted in a defeat. Several nobles and hundreds of soldiers were killed, and the Moors only allowed the Portuguese to withdraw after securing a commitment that they would abandon Ceuta. As a guarantee of this promise, Prince Dom Fernando, who volunteered to take his brother Henrique's place, remained as a hostage. The tragic outcome profoundly affected King Duarte, who already suffered from depressive episodes. The failure of the campaign and the painful decision of either giving up Ceuta to free Dom Fernando or holding on to the city and risking the prince's life became the dominant issue in the final months of the king's life. Duarte died in 1438. During Prince Dom Pedro's regency, 1439 to 1448, there was no effort to resume military offensives in Morocco. Instead, the debate that consumed the royal court focused on the same dilemma that had haunted Duarte: Ceuta or Dom Fernando. Time ultimately resolved the matter with the death of the prince in captivity in Fez in 1443. The Moroccan campaign was only revived later under the reign of King Afonso V. Afonso had shown interest in joining a grand Christian crusade against the Ottoman Turks following the fall of Constantinople in 1453. When that crusade failed to materialize, he turned his attention back to Morocco. There, he could continue fighting the enemies of the Christian faith and simultaneously improve Ceuta's defensive situation by ending its isolation and restarting Portuguese offensives in North Africa. In 1457, a new fleet assembled in Lagos, with ships arriving from various ports across the kingdom. Afonso V himself joined the campaign, along with Prince Dom Henrique once again. Although Afonso's initial target was Tangier, intended as revenge for the 1437 defeat and for Dom Fernando's death, he was persuaded by those familiar with the enemy to redirect the effort to Alcácer Ceguer, a smaller port located between Ceuta and Tangier. The town fell to the Portuguese in October 1458 without much resistance. However, due to its small size and limited importance, its capture did not significantly change the strategic situation. Like Ceuta, Alcácer Ceguer had to be fully supplied by Portugal and remained dependent on the kingdom for support. Tangier continued to cast a dark shadow over the crown's conquest plans. In 1463, another fleet set sail under the king's command to capture the city, but a storm once again foiled the attempt. Afonso V persisted, but misfortunes continued into the following year, when an assault was repelled by local defenders. It was not until 1471 that the long-sought objective of capturing Tangier was finally achieved. The initial target had been Asilah, considered easier to seize. The effectiveness of Portuguese artillery led the defenders to seek negotiations. The fall of Asilah alarmed the residents of nearby Tangier. With Ceuta, Alcácer Ceguer, and now Asilah under Portuguese control, and little hope of support from Moroccan forces, the population of Tangier abandoned the city. The Portuguese army entered without resistance, led by the king and his heir, Prince Dom João. More than 50 years after the conquest of Ceuta, Portugal had finally managed to establish and stabilize a stretch of coastal territory that included Ceuta, Alcácer Ceguer, Asilah, and Tangier. The Portuguese presence in North Africa was no longer confined to a single isolated enclave. While expansion into the interior remained limited, the Portuguese had established military dominance, ended Ceuta's isolation, collected tribute from local populations, and negotiated with the divided and weakened Muslim authorities. Despite the many difficulties of conquest and occupation, the Portuguese presence in the region became consolidated and would endure for years to come.